Well, hello. Thanks for joining me for another class on memorizing the Bible. You know, this is supposed to be a process that makes Bible study easier for us. It gives us a tool to help us remember what the books of the Bible are all about. Now, if it makes it more complicated for you, well, then it's not going to work for you, is it? I mean, what I'm thinking about here is 1 Samuel, for instance. I use the word transition. And sometimes I'm sitting there going, now what was the word for 1 Samuel? And I can't remember what it was. But I do know what 1 Samuel's about. And sometimes I think, well, the better word for 1 Samuel would just be Samuel. I mean, the book is about Samuel. And it starts off with his association with Eli, the priest. And then his two sons are introduced to us, Hophni and Phinehas. And then we see this transitional period where the people are clamoring for a king. And so God calls out Saul, and Saul becomes the first king. And then Saul falls out of favor with God because of his disobedience. And then we're introduced to David. And David is first introduced, and we find him coming and being anointed by Samuel. And then he's going to go and meet Goliath. And then the story ends with some tension between Saul and David. Well, that's the story of 1 Samuel. And 2 Samuel is a continuation of 1 Samuel. At one time it was just one book, 1 and 2 Samuel. And so 2 Samuel is the continuation of 1 Samuel. And I just use a name for 2 Samuel. What I remember with 2 Samuel is it's about David. David is a complex person. And 2 Samuel, here, if I describe 2 Samuel with one word, it's David. And so with these one word associations with the book is just to help us to remember what the entire book's about. And you could change it to whatever works better for you. And if you've come up with a better word, well, put it in the comments below. Maybe that would be a good one for me. Sometimes I struggle. What's a good word? It'll help me remember what the entire book is about. Well, 2 Samuel is about David. It's about the good and bad aspects of the life of David, the highlights of his reign, the highlights of his success, and the highlights of his disobedience. We see his fall at the end. We see his adultery and his murder and his indifference. And so the book is basically, it breaks down into two sections: David's triumphs, and the second half is David's, you can say David's tragedies. And so you have the first part of 2 Samuel talking about how David rose to be a king, and then the second part of it is how troubles came into his reign. And so 1 Samuel ends with the death of Saul, and 2 Samuel begins with David learning about the death of Saul and his good friend Jonathan, Saul's son. And David's a complex person, the Amalekite that announces the death of Saul, and he has actually found Saul when he's near death, and Saul begs him to put him to death, and he does. And David doesn't like that. David doesn't like that he put his hand on the Lord's anointed, and David has this man put to death. So there's some things that are somewhat hard to understand. But after that, David is made king of Judah. Now, Judah is the southern kingdoms, and then Israel is the top kingdoms, the northern 10 tribes, and we usually say the southern 2 tribes make up the tribe of Judah, or the nation of Judah. Now, Saul's son, Ishbosheth, becomes the king in the north. And it will take about 7.5 years for David to finally unite the north and south together and to become a united kingdom. Now, there's a subplot throughout this. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of sad at the same time. The subplots between Abner and Joab. Abner is the captain of the armies of Saul, and he continues to be the captains of the army of Ishbosheth. And then there's Joab. He is the commander of the armies under David. And these men are vicious guys. I mean, these are warriors. They are somewhat vengeful, and it ends up with the murder of Abner. Now, Abner is the one who's keeping the northern kingdom going and Ishbosheth going. And finally, he has it with Ishbosheth. Says, "Okay, I'm giving up on you. I'm going to go down and help David." And Ishbosheth ends up being assassinated. Well, David, we watch David, and David's dealing with a lot of different things. He has defeated the Jebusites in chapter 5, and he takes Jerusalem, and it is going to become known as the city of David, as Zion. And then there is a series of wars with the Philistines that is talked about in 2 Samuel, and how David brings the ark back to Jerusalem. And David wants to build a house for God. And we read this in the 7th chapter. He wants to build a house for God, and instead God says, I'll build a house for you. And he's talking more than just a building. He's talking about establishing David's house as the rulers over Israel. Now, when you look at it, Israel it ends up with about 9 different dynasties ruling over Israel. The southern kingdom of Judah is only going to have one dynasty, the dynasty of David, the dynasty of the tribe of Judah. And of course, Jesus is going to come from the tribe of Judah, and he's in the lineage of David, and he's going to be the king after David. David, it tells us, is a man after God's own heart. Chapter 7, verses 18 through 29. Here's a man who is humble. He is spiritual. He's a man after God's own heart. And you say, well, how does he do some of the things he does, though? There's some contradictions in his life, I suppose, like there is in all of our lives. There's some things that just don't make sense. David prospers. Chapter 8, verses 14 and 15 talks about how he's prospering. He's going to honor Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth. Now then, if 2 Samuel ended in chapter 10, David would be great. All we would know about is the successes of David. There's no major failings. Everything is honorable. I suppose it would be the same as if Adolf Hitler died in 1939. People might think he was actually a great leader. He had done some good things for Germany. But unfortunately, he didn't die in 1939, and unfortunately, the story doesn't end in chapter 10 because things are going to fall apart. You know, unfortunately, that happens in the lives of many Christians, many preachers, many elders. They have a tremendous beginning, but things don't end well. One of my prayers has always been, God, please help me to end well. Whether it's into my life, into my ministry, whatever it is, don't allow me to allow pride or lust to cause shame upon myself or upon the name of God. They'll lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That's a very real prayer. And there's a turning point in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. This is when things begin to go downhill for David. It starts off with the words, "Then it happened." I'm always amused by that term, "then it happened." When I was a young kid, we used to watch a TV show called Sea Hunt. Lloyd Bridges was the star of the show. He's the father of Jeff Bridges and Bo Bridges. But anyway, he would be under the water, and then some tragedy would happen, and he would say, "Oh, and then it happened." Well, that's what happened. Things are going really well, and then it happens. Bathsheba comes on the scene. And this is a defining moment in the life of David. And David takes advantage of his position. He takes advantage of Bathsheba. He does a terrible, horrible thing. And, who is responsible for this? It's not Bathsheba. It is totally David. David commits adultery. And then on top of that, he has Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. He has him murdered. And we're going to find out later that Uriah was one of his great men. He was one of David's mighty men. And so he must have known him really well for him to be one of the mighty men of David. But things just really turn south here. And he commits adultery. He has Uriah murdered. And then Nathan calls him out on this. And Nathan tells him that God is going to punish him for this. And what happens is David has some sons, and things just go downhill. Ammon loves his half-sister Tamar and plots a way to get together with her, and in the end he ends up raping her. And what does David do? Well, he doesn't do anything. I mean, what's he supposed to say? Son, you shouldn't be doing these kinds of things. Well, Dad, you know what you did. You have no moral standing. You have no moral ground to touch me, anything. He didn't do anything. And then his son Absalom, who is Tamar's full brother, he's very upset that Ammon gets away with this in his mind. And so what he does is seeks revenge for his sister, and he has Ammon murdered. He kills Ammon. And what does David do? He doesn't do anything. And Absalom ends up taking off, and then he ends up coming back. And there's just a breakdown in this family, and there's a breakdown in the kingdom. Absalom was going to lead a revolt. David's going to be forced to flee, and in the end, Absalom is going to be killed. Then there's going to be another revolt with Sheba, and then there's going to be another revolt. There's going to be constant battles that plague the life of David after this. The consequences of sin, the results of sin, are something that cannot be avoided. We think about sin sometimes. Well, God will forgive me. Yes, God will forgive you. There's grace for forgiveness. But the consequences of sin can be very real, very painful, and very hard. Sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death, James tells us. And so the story ends with a famine because Saul had killed the Gibeonites. Another kind of strange story. And Saul's sons are going to be killed out of revenge. And one of the highlights for me anyway, and something that's always given me encouragement, is in chapter 23 or 21. Chapter 21. Verses 15 through 22, when it starts talking about the wars with the Philistines, it talks about all these giants. There was war with the Philistines again at Gob, and Ethian, the son of Jeroboam, the Benjaminite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Another Goliath, not the Goliath David killed, obviously. And there was war at Gath again, and there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also had been born to the giants. Another giant. And when he defiled Israel, Jonathan the son of Shemuel, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were born to the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. One of the things that always encourages me, and one thing I always think about, is how many giant killers were in Saul's army. Well, none. When Goliath came out and taunted the armies of God, there was no one to take a stand for God except for David, who really wasn't part of Saul's army at the time. How many giant killers are in David's army? Well, it seems like they're just everywhere, because it takes one to make one. Once David shows it can be done, then others follow. And then in chapters 22 and 23, there are a couple of Psalms of David. We think of the Psalms of David in the book of Psalms, and here's some Psalms of David in the book of 2 Samuel. And then you have in chapter 23 at the end the exploits of David's mighty men. And in the end, things take another turn for worse, because David's going to take a census in chapter 24. There's only 24 chapters in this book. It's really rather a small book. Because David's taken this census out of pride and not because God's asking him to do this, it results in the loss of 70,000 people. In the end, it ends with David purchasing property to build the temple. Of course, David's not going to be allowed. It's going to be his son by Bathsheba. Solomon is going to be the one who does it. Now, the son that he has an affair with Bathsheba ends up dying. She'll get pregnant again and have Solomon. He is a man after God's own heart. 2 Samuel is very complex. He could humble himself. He could seek God. One of the great Psalms is Psalm 51, written about this time with Bathsheba and the times of his sinful time in life. He's not sinless. He had multiplied wives. He had added concubines. He allowed lust and pride and indifference to hurt him. But the great words of his in Psalm 51, it kind of makes you wonder, wow, this is a really complex man. Be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. According to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin, for I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you only, I have sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified when you speak and blameless when you judge. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Behold, you desire truth in the innermost being, and in the hidden part you make me known wisdom. Purify me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear joy and gladness. Let the bones which you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will be converted to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, the God of my salvation. Then my tongue will joyfully sing of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise, for you do not delight in sacrifice. Otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, and a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. By your favor, do good to Zion. Build the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in righteous sacrifices, and burnt offering and whole burnt offering. Then young bulls will be offered on your altar. What a great psalm there of David. It reveals his heart. David is going to be named more times in the Bible than any other person other than Jesus. You'll find the name of David being written about more than anyone other than Jesus. But I can think you could say with David, thank God we have a marvelous God who is so willing to forgive us. Thank God that we have such a marvelous Savior. So, 2 Samuel, if I had to describe it in one word, it's about David. It's about the complexities of David. First half show us how he triumphs and how he does good and how he finally becomes the united king over Israel and Judah. And then the second half, unfortunately, is the tragedy and trouble of David's life. So that's 2 Samuel. Well, thank you for joining me. I look forward to meeting you again next week.